Namaskar. A warm welcome to World News and Indian Perspective on All India Radio. This is Gaurav Sharma and with me is Navneet Singh bringing glimpses of the major developments of the day from across the globe. Over the next half an hour, we shall bring to you the latest from the world of politics, economy, sports, entertainment and more. The headlines. Prime Minister Narendra Modi to address the third ministerial conference on counter-terrorism financing in New Delhi on Friday. India committed to domestic action and multilateral cooperation on climate change, says Environment Minister of India Bhupendra Yadav. Russia and Ukraine agree to extend grain deal by 4 months. British Finance Minister says country is in recession, announces tax hikes and spending cuts. China reports over 23,000 new COVID cases to build quarantine facility with 2.5 lakh beds in Guangzhou. And in cricket, the first T20 between India and New Zealand to be held in Wellington on Friday. Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi will deliver the inaugural address at the third No Money for Terror Ministerial Conference on Counter-Terrorism Financing in New Delhi on Friday. The two-day conference will offer a unique platform for participating nations and organizations to deliberate on effectiveness of the international regime on counter-terrorism financing. This conference will enhance the global cooperation to restrict the financing sources to terrorists. Apart from 70 countries, 15 multilateral international organizations including Interpol, FATF and all the connected multilateral organizations and stakeholders in terror financing will participate in the event. The conference will be attended by 450 delegates from across the world including ministers, heads of multilateral organizations and Financial Action Task Force FATF heads of delegations. During the conference, deliberations will be held in 4 sessions which will focus on global trends in terrorism and terrorist financing, use of formal and informal channels of funds for terrorism, emerging technologies and terrorist financing, and international cooperation to address challenges in combating terrorist financing.
India's Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav participated in a session on accelerating resilient infrastructure in small island developing states SIDS at COP27 summit at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Speaking at the session, Mr. Yadav said, India is committed to both domestic action and multilateral cooperation on climate change. He said India will continue to fight all global environmental concerns in the call to protect humanity's planetary home. He said the Government of India stands firmly committed to safeguarding the interests of SIDS in a changing climatic regime. He mentioned that considering per capita emissions for an objective scale for comparison, India's emissions are even today about 1/3 of the global average.
India and Australia convened their 5th bilateral cyber policy dialogue today in New Delhi. The cyber policy dialogue was held under the auspices of the India-Australia Framework Arrangement on Cyber and Cyber-Enabled Critical Technology Cooperation and Plan of Action 2020 to 2025 for a comprehensive and deeper cyber cooperation. The dialogue was co-chaired by Joint Secretary Cyber Diplomacy Division Mohanpui Sayavi from the Ministry of External Affairs. The Cyber Policy Dialogue provides a bilateral platform to discuss a range of high-profile issues of mutual interest. Discussions at this dialogue included strategic priorities, cyber threat assessment, next-generation telecommunications including 5G technology, capacity building and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, and the latest developments in cyber at the United Nations. Australia and India agreed to explore opportunities for further collaboration with private sector and academia. Both the countries will jointly conduct a cyber boot camp as well as cyber and tech policy exchanges in collaboration with the Indo-Pacific partners.
India's Chief Election Commissioner Rajiv Kumar has been invited by Election Commission of Nepal as international observer for the forthcoming election to Nepal's House of Representatives and Provincial Assembly. The elections are scheduled on 20th of this month to elect 275 members of the Federal Parliament and 550 seats of the 7 provincial assemblies. Mr. Kumar will be leading a delegation of ECI officials as state guest in Nepal from 18th to 22nd of this month. During the visit, he will be visiting polling stations at Kathmandu and areas around.
India has participated in the fourth meeting of the Moscow Format consultations on Afghanistan held in Moscow. The participants of the Moscow format discussed the current situation in Afghanistan with a focus on regional security, military political stability, and socio-economic and humanitarian issues. The participants reiterated their commitment to a peaceful, unified, sovereign, independent, and economically developing Afghanistan, which is free from the threats of terrorism and drug trafficking. They requested Afghanistan to fulfill its commitments to eradicate terrorism and drug trafficking emanating from the country. The Moscow format also urged Afghanistan to take more visible steps against all terrorist organizations and ensure that Afghanistan never serves as a safe haven for terrorists. According to India's Ministry of External Affairs, issues like the current humanitarian situation, efforts by various stakeholders to provide assistance, and the formation of an inclusive and representative government were also discussed during the meeting. A joint statement issued after the meeting stressed on creating a national reconciliation. The meeting was attended by special envoys and senior officials from Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan.
Russia and Ukraine have agreed to extend the grain deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey by another 120 days as the existing agreement was ending on November 19th. The deal allows grain exports from Ukrainian ports through a safe corridor in the Black Sea. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres welcomed the agreement by all parties to continue the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Ukraine's Infrastructure Minister Alexander Kubrov said that the decision was made in Istanbul after the talks were held for the same. So far, nearly 11 million tons of grain and foodstuff have been exported under the agreement. The grain export has served as a lifeline to Ukraine's crippled economy amid the ongoing conflict and helped ease food shortages around the world. The deal will continue with the existing provisions. Ships will carry grain from 3 Ukrainian ports of Chornomorsk, Odessa, and Yuzhny Pivdeny. They will travel through the humanitarian corridor set up in the Black Sea and stop in Istanbul for inspection before continuing to the final destination. The grain deal is vital for many African countries as they face crop failure due to weather extremes and internal conflicts. The nations will benefit from the deal include Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan, Senegal, Rwanda, Congo, Libya, Tanzania, and Namibia.
India's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ruchira Kamboj, has said that the impact of Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe, but Global South is especially facing serious economic consequences. In her remarks at the UNSC briefing on Ukraine on Thursday, she said that we are seeing growing concerns on energy and food security from the conflict. After severe stress due to the pandemic, Ms. Kamboj said that India hopes that the UN-facilitated Black Sea grains and fertilizer package deal will be renewed in the coming days and it will be implemented by all the parties earnestly in all aspects. She said that India remains concerned about the situation in Ukraine and the targeting of civilians. Ms. Kamboj said that New Delhi has consistently called for the cessation of hostilities and return to dialogue.
The United Kingdom government unveiled a £66 billion fiscal plan on Thursday as it seeks to plug a gaping hole in the public finances, aiming to restore Britain's economic credibility. British Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt outlined around £30 billion in spending cuts and £25 billion in tax hikes. Hunt said that like other countries, United Kingdom is now in recession. The finance minister said that the painful measures were needed to bring financial stability after recent turmoil and insisted that the measures would elevate rather than aggravate the downturn. Hunt triggered a fresh era of austerity just a day after official data showed the UK inflation rocketing to a 41-year high above 11%. The fiscal plan measures included a 6-year freeze on income tax thresholds and a lowering of the top rate of income tax to £125,000.
This is All India Radio giving you the world news. For quick news updates round the clock, follow us on our Twitter handle at AIR News Alerts.
China's daily new COVID cases continue to surge as the country reported 23,276 new COVID-19 infections on Wednesday. The new COVID cases across the country hit their highest level since April. China's National Health Commission said that 2,388 cases were symptomatic and 20,888 were asymptomatic. On Tuesday, China announced 20,199 new cases, out of which 1,623 were symptomatic and 18,576 asymptomatic infections. At present, Guangzhou, an industrial export hub in the south, is facing country's largest outbreak with more than 8,700 new locally transmitted cases announced on Wednesday, compared with about 6,300 cases a day before. Amid a surge in cases, officials in Guangzhou announced to set up makeshift hospitals and quarantine sites with capacity for nearly 250,000 beds for COVID-19 infections.
Sri Lanka has postponed a round of debt restructuring talks that were expected to be held on Thursday. Sri Lanka's State Minister of Finance, Shehan Semasinghe, said that the talks have been postponed to allow its central bank and treasury officials to provide clarifications sought by the country's creditors. Sri Lanka had commenced the talks in September after securing a preliminary $2.9 billion bailout with the International Monetary Fund amid the country's worst financial crisis. Among the island nation needs to secure financing assurances from key creditors including China, Japan and India to get the capital funds dispersed. Semasinghe said that there are different concerns from creditors and the government has decided that these clarifications would be communicated first to the creditors and then new dates would be set for another round of talks.
In today's Hotspot section, we bring to you a discussion on outcomes and highlights of G20 summit that concluded in Indonesia on Wednesday. In conversation are strategic analyst Dr. Harshvardhan Pant and AIR correspondent Gaurang Dhawanlal.
The G20 summit had a successful conclusion today in Bali, Indonesia. And we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Harsh V. Pant from the Observer Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Harsh V. Pant.
Thank you very much.
So, sir, the G20 summit just concluded in Bali. The presidency was handed over to India. Prime Minister Modi took over the keys from the Indonesian president. So, a successful conclusion to the summit and one in which India's voice was heard loud and clear and also echoed by the others. So, what do you think of India's role, particularly in this summit?
I think this has been a particularly interesting summit for India. Of course, the highlight remained the joint statement where Mr. Modi's advice to Russian president was carried verbatim in some ways that this is not the time for war. But I think it also highlighted the ability of India to shape global conversations in today's context in the way that perhaps we have not seen in the past. And so I think as the summit concluded and as we heard from several other speakers at the summit, there is a great expectation from India as India takes over the presidency of G20 for the next year. And at a time, particularly when global order is fragmented, when there is polarization, when we are facing enormous challenges, geopolitical, geoeconomic, as well as the fact that wars are raging, which are having an impact on some of the poorest countries in the world. So I think India managed to steer the conversation, at least in this summit, in a direction in which it wanted. And hopefully that's the direction it will continue during its presidency as well.
So we've always believed in India that it is better to be assertive. I think aggression is not some stance that we take. And words like collective, together, collaborate, co-create. And now they are being reiterated more and more, and even other countries are echoing it. So do you think that this is a time when there will be more cohesiveness and togetherness in future decisions?
Well, one hopes so, but I think we also know that whether it is the interaction between the developed and the developing world, or whether it is the interaction between Western countries and Russia, we are looking at a lot of polarization in the international system. And that, I think, contributes in a way to a sense of urgency that the international order, international community should move in a direction which perhaps, as you point out, should move towards greater cohesiveness, towards a greater unity, towards a greater sense of purpose, because the global challenges need global responses. And what I think India has tried to do is to emerge as a voice of sanity among, multiple conflagrations, multiple challenges where countries, nations, geographies are moving in extremely divergent directions. So I think there is a lot of burden on India's shoulders at this point, because India is probably seen as a country that can bring these multiple voices together, that can bring these divergent points of views together on a platform where perhaps a message goes out that this is actually a time when you have to concentrate on building global order at a time of great disruption. And so certainly I think India's traditional understanding that aggression is not the answer, that violence is not the answer, resonates well at this particular point amongst the most poorest, amongst the most vulnerable countries in the world, because their voices are often not heard. And India wants to be a voice of those emerging and developing countries.
Right. Dr. Pant, you spoke about the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable nations are the ones that struggle with any adversity. It affects them the maximum. And when we talk of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they are required in a greater degree for the developing and the underdeveloped countries. What role do you feel have developed countries to play in this? And obviously, sometimes we feel that maybe they're not taking full responsibility. But do you feel that somewhere India is moving in and actually somewhere bridging the gap between the so-called divide that happens, that's going to now be bridged better?
Well, India, I think, will try to play that role because, as we know, a lot of these conversations are about that divide, whether it is climate change, whether it is climate adaptation, whether it is sustainable development, and whether it is the economic crisis, the food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis that we are witnessing today. Most of the burden is borne by some of the most vulnerable countries whose voices often are not part of the discourse. And so India, as I think our External Affairs Minister has also said, wants to be the voice of the global South in this conversation, wants to project their voices onto the global stage. And I think G20 allows India to do that in a way that perhaps other platforms do not. And we heard the Prime Minister also at the Bali Summit talk about how United Nations, for example, as a platform has failed in the last few crises. And that's a reality that the world is facing. And therefore, when we talk of climate change, India has been forefront of this conversation, saying that, look, unless the developed countries take a larger part of the burden, unless they start providing greater finance, greater technology, greater possibilities of adaptation, and then I think the whole conversation is pointless. And that is something that I think India brings to the table, where it brings a certain sensitivity about the issues that the developing world is facing and can also push the developed world in a direction that the developed world has been reluctant so far. Now, for a lot of the countries, this is a difficult task, but I think for India, given its rising global stature, given the way that it has a historical connect with the developing world, certain possibilities emerge. And I would think that's an area, that's a direction that India wants to go as it takes over this presidency. And as it wants to shape the global order and not merely be a recipient of the global order, and wants to proactively shape the architecture of the global governance. So I think this makes it particularly important time in India's global governance role, as well as in this conversation that should happen between the developed and the developing world.
We also talk a lot about recovery, and of course there is the post-pandemic recovery, but of course there is still a crisis, less experienced in India because of, I think, wise policies, more forward-looking decisions. But in terms of how, because we're all linked at the hip, no country can progress or actually get mired in slow growth for a long time, because somewhere or the other, one day we will all be affected by it. So when we talk of the recovery scenario, what do you think that we have done well, and where do you think that India can actually, be a leader, regional leader in this area?
I think we have done exceptionally well in terms of just emerging at a time of great crisis, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And I think that adds to India's credibility that despite the pandemic, despite the geopolitical crisis, despite the energy crisis, India has been able to make its mark on the global economic order as a country, as a nation that is serious about governance, and that has been able to provide effective governance both in terms of distributing the welfare to some of the most marginalized communities in the country, in ensuring that inflation doesn't hit the roof, in ensuring that welfare schemes are protected at a time of deficient resources, but also maintaining the economic growth trajectory which very few nations have been able to do. Despite their multiple economic programs and multiple agendas, we have seen that most nations are still trying to recover, whereas India has shown to the world that it is possible to provide effective governance domestically at a time of multiple crises like the one that we have been facing. And that adds to India's credibility as an actor that perhaps can also provide effective governance at the global level. So as an exemplar, I think India stands out. And that means that this role that India has today is one where it is showcasing its own strengths. And I think Prime Minister talked about India's advancements, India's digital capabilities, India's capabilities in terms of distribution of resources, India's capabilities in terms of what we showed during the COVID as a pharmaceutical industry that tried to reach out to a large part of the world. And I think what India's philosophy that, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, that ensures that India is not simply looking inwards, even at the time of crises. India is also thinking about larger public goods. India is thinking of global governance, and India is engaged in providing sustenance to some of those countries about whom very few countries think about. So during pandemic and post-pandemic recovery, when most countries were looking more and more inwards, India perhaps was one of the few countries that was trying to ensure that that inward orientation did not mar the prospects of India's growth, and that inward orientation did not come at the cost of other countries. And I think that's a message that India would like to deliver, and India would like to take forward as it takes over the presidency of G20.
So do you think that the past crisis that we have seen and are continuing to see has somewhere sensitized the developed countries to also know that actually it's one earth, one family, one future? As you said, that's how we look at it. And to see that, they cannot work in isolation. They have to take others. Do you think that sensitivity has increased?
I think so. I think that sensitivity has increased because initially the developed world was very reluctant. If you recall their response to the initial phase of the pandemic, everyone was just focused on their own health of the citizens. But gradually, I think, and to a considerable extent, because India pushed very hard on multiple platforms and global platforms, we saw developed world coming together in terms of pharmaceuticals, in terms of vaccine delivery, their vaccine production, etc. So there has been some sensitization. But I think, what we are also witnessing today is certain kind of economic deceleration that we are witnessing. That is putting constraints on what even the developed world can do. Because at a time when economic recovery is not happening, at a time when domestic constituencies want more state support from their governments, it becomes very difficult for even the most wealthiest countries, even the wealthiest countries, to think globally. And I think that's what we are witnessing today in the developed world, where a lot of the clamor is for a domestic management of these problems rather than a more global outlook. And as a result, we have had a lot of concerns whether the world will be able to fulfill the SDG requirements, for example, the Millennium Development Goals, for example, will be attained by 2030, because we are moving back on a number of fronts at a number of levels, whether it is climate sustenance, climate adaptation, green finance, green technology. We have not seen the kind of commitment that is needed to bring some of the poorest countries to where they should be by 2030. So I think there are growing concerns because of the economic downturn that the global community is facing, major powers are facing. And because of that global economic downturn, they are increasingly looking more and more inwards. And that is challenging, perhaps, the way they look at the world and how they look at global governance.
Right, I think very beautifully put. Dr. Harshveer Pant, thank you so much for coming on to our program today. It was a pleasure being in conversation with you.
Thank you, Gaurav.
Myanmar's military government announced on Thursday that it will release and deport around 6,000 prisoners, including several foreigners, under an amnesty to mark the country's National Day. The foreigners who have been freed include an Australian economist, Sean Turnell, an ex-British ambassador, Vicky Bowman, and a Japanese filmmaker, Toru Kubota. Sean Turnell was a former advisor to the democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi. According to Myanmar state media, the foreigners were given amnesty for their relationship with other countries and also for humanitarian purposes.
The key Indian indices witnessed modest losses on Thursday. Both indices declined amid negative cues from global share markets. The Sensex closed near 61,750 points, while the Nifty settled below 18,350 level, a report from the business desk.
Sensex fell by 230 points, a 0.37% to close at 61,751. Nifty also slipped by 66 points, a 0.36% to end at 18,344. At the global stock markets, Asian stocks witnessed losses except Singapore Straits Times, which added 0.6%. South Korea's Kospi plunged 1.4% and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index declined 1.2%. Japan's Nikkei 225 fell 0.4% and China's Shanghai Composite Index slipped 0.2%. Oil extended losses as concerns over geopolitical tensions eased and as rising numbers of COVID-19 cases in China added to demand worries in the world's largest crude importer. Crude prices fell around 1.5%. Back home at the multi-commodity exchange, gold futures for December was trading at 52,980 rupees per 10 grams. Arjun Chaudhary for World News, All India Radio.
And moving on to sports now. In cricket, India will take on New Zealand in the first T20 match of the three-match series at Sky Stadium in Wellington on Friday. The match will begin at 12 noon Indian Standard Time. For India, some key players like Rohit Sharma, Virat Kohli, KL Rahul, Ravindra Jadeja and Jasprit Bumrah will be absent from the tour. In the absence of skipper Rohit Sharma and vice-captain KL Rahul, Shikhar Dhawan will lead the one-day international team, while Hardik Pandya will be the captain of the T20 team. For New Zealand, their all-format skipper Kane Williamson will lead the one-day international and the T20 side. The second T20 will be played at Bay Oval at Mount Maunganui on November the 20th, and the third T20 will be played at McLean Park in Napier on November the 22nd. The one-day international series will follow the T20 series. The first one-day international will take place on November the 25th at Eden Park in Auckland. The second one-day international will be played on November the 27th at Seddon Park in Hamilton, while the third one-day international will be played on November the 30th at Hagley Oval in Christchurch.
In the Asian Airgun Championships, India's team of Manu Bhaker, Isha Singh and Shikha Narwal bagged another gold medal in the tournament in Daegu, South Korea on Thursday. They defeated South Korean team of Yang Jin, Kim Min Seo and Kim Jui 16-12 in 10 meters air pistol women's junior team event.
And now let us take a look at the major developments around the world as reported in the foreign press. The Guardian reports from COP27 that developing countries demand agreement on loss and damage fund as leaders criticize gaps in climate draft.
The Financial Times says France and Germany to fire up stalled fighter jet project.
The Wall Street Journal reports that new FTX CEO says company suffered complete failure of corporate controls.
Le Monde reports that British government unveils austerity budget despite recession.
The Washington Post writes, Dutch court convicts 3 of murder in MH17 jet downing over Ukraine in 2014.
Japan Times reports that Beijing's freeze on Taipei contact fuels concern over risk of military clash.
And South China Morning Post says Japan's foreign minister set for China visit after Xi Kishida meeting. And before we end the bulletin, a quick look at the headlines once again. Prime Minister Narendra Modi to address the third ministerial conference on counter-terrorism financing in New Delhi on Friday. India committed to domestic action and multilateral cooperation on climate change, says Environment Minister of India Bhupendra Yadav. Russia and Ukraine agree to extend grain deal by 4 months. British Finance Minister says country is in recession, announces tax hikes and spending cuts. China reports over 23,000 new COVID cases to build quarantine facility with 2.5 lakh beds in Guangzhou. And in cricket, the first T20 between India and New Zealand to be held in Wellington on Friday.
And now, before we end, let us listen to Mahatma Gandhi's favorite bhajan, Vaishnav Jan, by artists from Oman.
वैष्णो भजन तो तेने कहिए जे पीड़ पराई जाने रे पर दुखे उपकार करे तो ये मन अभिमान नाने रे वैष्णो भजन तो तेने कहिए जे पीड़ पराई जाने रे सकल लोग
And with that, we end this bulletin. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the next edition of World News.